Now, the institutional issues that were raised, because, again, there are the government issues, but then there are also the institutions. There's a question of who is policing all this. I think one of our previous speakers mentioned who is regulating all this, who is in charge of this. And these have been problems that people have raised down the years, as you rightfully acknowledged. Who is doing that now? I mean, because not only is this government trying to see that it will complete projects that it met, but it is also bringing about new ones.
Yes.
How is that being done to avoid these pitfalls?
Yeah, one thing this government does scrupulously is to follow due process in the award of all these contracts and projects. Anything that is above 50 billion naira must come to the Federal Executive Council. And before the Federal Executive Council will endorse any project or contract, the Bureau of Public Procurement must have signed off on that project, that it is worthy to be done and the projections are good and they are reasonable. That this government does not joke about. And it is one of the safety valves against the kind of things we had suffered in the past.
Now, let me return to the basic issue of infrastructure itself and now use some typical examples. The issue of roads, for example. There have been back and forth. Before we had toll gates, which funds were to be used from those toll gates to maintain those roads. At some point, that policy was reversed and there were to be no toll gates. The roads were to be maintained by FEMA or the Ministry of Works or some of those agencies. But today, one of our previous segment guests did point out that virtually in every geopolitical zone, you can identify a number of significantly bad roads which have deteriorated over the years. If you talk about hospitals, government-owned hospitals, more or less the same story. Schools, the same thing. Now, I am aware that there are some things being done differently to change this narrative, but they do appear to be ad hoc, responding as the situation is developing. How do we do this better?
I think you've hit on a very serious issue. And that is that what we tend to do is, rather than, when we spot a problem, rather than tackle that problem, we sidestep it or create another agency. You cannot argue against tolling some roads. You can't argue against that. The issue is because there was corruption in the collection of the money at the toll gates. Rather than deal with that corruption, you instead remove the toll gates, which then denied you the resources you would have got to maintain the roads. And we do that consistently. And so yes, you're right. Some of that kind of decision was ad hoc. It wasn't based on proper analysis. It wasn't based on taking the hard decisions that needed to be taken at the time. So if you take an example, we recently complained to the Minister of Transportation about some fraud in the ticketing of the Abuja to Kaduna rail system. Did he shut down the rail system? No. What he did was to remove those people perpetrating that corruption. That's the right thing to do. And that's what we've often shied away from doing in the past. And because of that, yes, we complain about not having sufficient revenue, but even the little we have, just like Madam here said, even the little we have, we are not maximizing its potential because we are not sanctioning, we are not taking the difficult decisions that need to be taken. We're not, we're not removing people who are obstacles to progress. That's why we're struggling in terms of school infrastructure. That's why we're struggling in terms of hospital infrastructure. You get monies released to teaching hospitals, released to schools. The chief medical directors or the vice chancellors don't want you to be accountable. They don't want to be accountable. They don't want the implementation of the integrated payroll and personnel information system that makes sure that everybody is accounted for biometrically. They don't want that. So long as you don't take the decisions necessary, these things simply just get worse.
Now, Dr. Edoko, I'm going to throw the question you asked rhetorically earlier on back at you to answer, which is, how do we regulate this in an institutional manner? The government spokesman is here, and I'm sure that he will probably take that away with him to Abuja. How do we regulate this? Because it does appear as if the government today wants to do something about it. You've just heard the example about the Minister of Transport. There are other examples. But again, I return to the issue of ad hoc. How do you do this in a structured manner?
Well, I think it's a difficult question. A difficult question in the sense that you have institutions already set up to regulate, but they don't have the capacities to regulate. So what do you do about that? Do you start all over again to review their capacities, or do you create new institutions? So that brings me to the point of strengthening our institutions, because they are already institutions who ought to regulate these things. Apart from that, you have laws in the statute books, and these laws are not enforced, because also you have the culture of the big man in Nigeria, where the big man is bigger than the institution. So the big man commits fraud and gets away with it. So until you also have strong institutions that regulate the big man, these things will continue to happen. So the big man syndrome is an issue here. It's a phenomenon that doesn't exist in a sane society, except in a society that is pseudo, if I should use the word. So how do you tackle the issue of the big man? That's a big question.
Until you have provide a big answer.
Pardon?
Provide a big answer.
Yes, until you have strong institutions, very strong institutions that tower above the big man to subdue the big man and subject the big man to the law of the land. Until that happens, you cannot have a sane system, a sane process. Also, the judiciary, must be a strong institution to enforce the laws.
I'm going to give a minute each to Mr. Adesina and Mrs. Benite. I see you wrote leaders on that sheet of paper there. So I guess it goes back to the issue of the leaders. What do you mean?
For us, we do a little bit of a research on the book by Jim Collins. Of course, it's not a book that maybe you say it's everything. But Jim Collins said something that interested our own focus group and discussion over the years, is that whether it's an organization or a nation, when you call government entrepreneurship at a large scale, meaning that government is business, meaning that government should not be suffering losses, government should not allow these things, must regulate, as he has said. But he said, first of all, you must have disciplined people who have disciplined thoughts and can take disciplined actions. The reality at hand is that the Nigerian narrative today, as it is, the government, individuals, we need a high level of training. The national orientation, I don't know what in its fullness is doing at this point, but there is a requirement for retraining and training again within the sectors and understanding the international standards, not based on it is coming from abroad, but what is applicable that works.
I'll put you on pause there. Mr. Adesina.
Yes, I'd like to continue from that, still talking of leadership. Leadership at all time must have the will, the ability, and the capacity to do all that is right. And, you may say I'm not the one that should say it.
No, you can say it.
But then, the leadership we have now. The only person who gets away with impunity is the person against whom nothing has been proven. If anything is proven against you, you have subverted the system in a way you will never survive it. You can't get away with it. And that is the beginning of building of strong institutions.
Thank you very, very much. It's at that point that we're going to have to leave it. Mr. Femi Adesina is the Special Advisor to the President on Media. Thank you for making out the time to be with us today. Mrs. Juliet Benite, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you,
Dr.
sir.
Nikki Diko, thank you so much for being with us. And Mr. Joe Abba, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.